They said the winter of 1873 would break any man who tried to farm the high plains alone, but no one expected it would begin with a frozen girl at Ethan Caldwell's fence. The wind had been howling across the Kansas prairie since sundown, the kind of dry winter wind that slipped through the cracks of a wooden house and rattled the lantern on the table like a warning. Ethan Caldwell had lived with wind like that for years, long enough to know when it was just another cold night and when it carried something else with it. That night, it carried silence. The kind that settles across 100 empty acres and makes a man feel like the last soul left alive between the Arkansas River and the Rocky Mountains. Ethan stood in the doorway of his small farmhouse, pulling his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he looked out across the frozen pasture. The snow wasn't deep, maybe 3 inches at most, but the wind had pushed it into long pale waves across the land, turning his 40 acres into something that looked more like the ocean than farmland. His cattle huddled near the fence line, their breath drifting into the night air like smoke. It was the kind of cold that turned metal brittle and made a man think twice before stepping outside. Ethan had been about to close the door when he heard it. Not a shout, not even a word, just the sound of something collapsing against the far end of the fence, almost swallowed by the wind. At first he thought it might be a calf caught in the wire. That happens sometimes in winter storms. But there was something about the sound that made him pause. A hesitation, like the land itself had taken a breath. Ethan grabbed the lantern from the table and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit into his face immediately, sharp as broken glass. But he kept walking, boots crunching over frozen dirt as he crossed the yard. The lantern light swung slowly in his hand, casting long shadows across the snow. Out here, a man learned to trust small instincts. Sometimes they were the difference between finding trouble and finding someone who needed help. The fence stood about 60 yards from the house, running along the edge of the pasture where the prairie opened wide and empty toward the north. Ethan could see something there now, a shape against the posts that didn't belong to the land or the cattle. At first it looked like a bundle of cloth caught in the wire. Then the lantern light shifted, and he saw a hand. Small, bare, half buried in the snow. Ethan's boots slowed as he approached, not out of fear exactly, but caution. Folks in the nearby town of Red Hollow had warned him plenty of times about strangers crossing the plains, especially strangers from tribes that traveled the high country. But warnings felt different when a human being was lying in the snow. He reached the fence and raised the lantern. The light revealed a young girl, maybe 16 or 17, wrapped in a thin buckskin dress stiff with frost. Her dark hair had frozen into strands along her shoulders, and her eyes were barely open. She looked up at him like someone who had already walked too far through the cold to be afraid anymore. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The wind moved across the prairie with a low, hollow sound, pushing snow against the fence posts. Ethan noticed the small turquoise pendant hanging around her neck, the kind worn by Apache families from the Southern Territories. He had never met an Apache girl before, but he had heard enough stories in Red Hollow to know what most men would have done next. Closed the door, pretended they never saw her. Let the cold finish what the prairie had started. Ethan Caldwell was not most men. He crouched slowly in the snow, setting the lantern beside him so the warm light fell across her face. Her lips moved, but only one word came out, soft and broken by the cold. Cold. Ethan looked out across the empty prairie again. Nothing moved. No riders. No smoke. Just miles of frozen land stretching into darkness. Then he slipped one arm beneath her shoulders and lifted her carefully from the snow. She weighed almost nothing. The wind pressed harder against his back as he carried her toward the farmhouse, as if the prairie itself had noticed what he was doing. Ethan didn't know who the girl was. He didn't know why she had come to his fence in the middle of winter. And he certainly didn't know that by the time the sun rose over the Kansas plains, the quiet life he had built on those 40 lonely acres would never be the same again. Ethan pushed the farmhouse door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, bringing the storm with him for a brief moment before the wooden door slammed shut against the wind. The warmth from the small iron stove filled the single room, carrying the smell of burning oak and the faint scent of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. He laid the girl carefully on the worn wool blanket beside the stove, brushing frost from her sleeves as gently as if she were made of glass. Up close, she looked even younger than he had first thought, her face pale from the cold, and her breathing slow but steady. Ethan removed his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders before moving quickly around the room, adding another log to the stove and setting a kettle of water above the fire. The house was small, just one main room with a narrow bed against the far wall, a wooden table near the window, and a pair of chairs that had seen better years. It was not much of a home, but it had kept Ethan Caldwell alive through 7 winters on the prairie. He poured a cup of warm water once the kettle began to steam and knelt beside her again. Her eyes fluttered open slightly when he touched the cup to her hands. They were still cold, but the color had begun to return to her fingers. She looked at him with confusion for a moment, as if she could not understand where she was or why she was no longer lying in the snow. Ethan spoke softly, the way a man might speak to a frightened horse, calm and steady. "You are safe here. Drink slowly." She tried, her hands trembling as she brought the cup to her lips. The water spilled once before she managed a small sip. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls again, rattling the windows and sending a line of snow drifting across the porch. Ethan stood and moved toward the door, sliding the iron latch into place before checking the small window beside the table. The prairie beyond the glass was still empty, nothing but pale moonlight and the rolling shadows of winter grass beneath the snow. No riders. No movement. Just the quiet stretch of Kansas land that had become his world. When he turned back, the girl was watching him. The firelight reflected in her dark eyes, making them seem brighter than before. She spoke again, her voice still weak but clearer this time. "Thank you." Ethan nodded once, setting the cup on the floor beside her. "You wandered a long way in this weather. The nearest settlement is nearly 12 miles south." She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached slowly for the turquoise pendant around her neck, holding it in her hand as if it reminded her of something important. Ethan noticed the movement but did not ask about it. A man who lived alone learned when to ask questions and when to wait for answers that came on their own. He brought a bowl of simple stew from the stove and placed it beside her, the warm smell filling the room. She hesitated before taking the spoon, glancing again toward the door as though listening for something beyond the walls. Ethan followed her gaze. Out here, travelers usually had reasons for moving through the prairie in winter, and those reasons were rarely simple. After a moment, she took a small bite, then another. Color slowly returned to her cheeks as the warmth spread through her. The silence between them lasted several minutes, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of the wind outside. Finally, she spoke again, quieter this time. "They will be looking for me." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Who will be looking for you?" Her eyes moved toward the window, toward the open prairie that had swallowed the night. "My people." The answer hung in the room like the last note of a song. Ethan had heard plenty about Apache riders traveling across distant territories, stories traded around the general store in Red Hollow. Some of those stories were filled with fear, others with respect, but none of them involved a young girl collapsing at a farmer's fence in the middle of winter. Ethan looked once more toward the window, then back at the girl beside the fire. Out here, news traveled slowly, but horses traveled faster than rumors. If her people were searching for her across the plains, they would not be far behind. The wind howled again outside the farmhouse, carrying snow across the empty pasture. Ethan Caldwell did not know exactly who would arrive first when morning came, but he had lived long enough on the frontier to understand one simple truth. Sometimes the smallest choice a man makes on a cold night can bring an entire world to his doorstep by sunrise. The fire burned lower as the night stretched across the prairie, but the warmth inside the farmhouse held steady, pushing back the cold that pressed against the walls like a patient visitor waiting for the door to open again. Ethan Caldwell sat near the stove with his hands folded loosely in his lap, watching the girl as she slowly finished the bowl of stew. The color had returned to her face now, though the weariness in her eyes remained. She moved carefully, like someone who had traveled farther than she had expected and was still unsure whether the ground beneath her feet would hold. Outside, the wind had begun to ease, leaving the land wrapped in a quiet so deep that Ethan could hear the soft ticking of cooling iron from the stove. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound inside the house feel larger than it should. The girl finally placed the spoon down and rested her hands around the turquoise pendant again. The stone caught the firelight for a moment, glowing softly against the buckskin fabric of her dress. Ethan noticed the way she held it, almost like a compass guiding her thoughts somewhere beyond the farmhouse walls. He leaned forward slightly in his chair. "You said your people will be looking for you." She nodded once, slowly. "Yes." Ethan glanced toward the dark window again. 12 miles separated his farm from Red Hollow, and the land between them was mostly open prairie and scattered cottonwood groves along the creek beds. Riders could cross it easily when the weather was clear. But winter storms made distances behave differently. Miles stretched longer under snow and wind. Still, if her people had begun searching before the storm came, they would not stop easily. He spoke again, his voice steady but curious. "Were you traveling alone?" The girl hesitated before answering. "No." The single word lingered in the air for a moment. Ethan waited. Out here a man learned that silence sometimes opened doors faster than questions did. After a moment she continued. "We were moving camp before the cold came. My father led us north of the river. The snow started early." Ethan nodded slowly. Winter had surprised more than one traveler that season. The first storm had arrived nearly 2 weeks ahead of what most ranchers expected. She looked toward the floor as she spoke again. "I left the trail when the wind became too strong. I thought I could reach the cottonwoods near the creek, but the snow covered everything." Her voice softened slightly. "I walked for many miles before I saw your fence." Ethan pictured the land in his mind, the long stretch of prairie that curved along the shallow creek about 2 miles west of his property. In summer it was easy to follow the water. In winter it disappeared beneath snow and drifting grass. A traveler could wander for hours without realizing how far they had gone off course. He leaned back again and folded his arms. "Your father must be worried." At that, the girl finally looked up fully. The firelight caught the reflection in her eyes again, and for the first time Ethan noticed something else there besides exhaustion. Confidence. "My father will find me." She said it quietly, but there was no doubt in her voice. Ethan gave a small nod. On the frontier, certainty like that usually meant something. Perhaps her father was a respected leader. Perhaps he simply knew the land better than most. Either way, if riders were searching for her, they would follow tracks, broken grass, and the faint signs that winter could not hide forever. The wind outside had nearly faded now. In its place came another sound, faint but steady, somewhere far across the frozen prairie. Ethan did not notice it at first. It blended with the quiet rhythm of the night. But after a few seconds the sound returned again. Distant, hollow, like something moving slowly over frozen ground. Ethan turned his head slightly toward the window. The girl noticed the movement and followed his gaze. "What is it?" she asked softly. Ethan did not answer right away. He rose from his chair and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand resting lightly on the latch. The sound came again, clearer this time. Not the wind, not an animal, something heavier, something traveling across open land in a steady rhythm. Ethan opened the door just enough for the cold air to slip inside. The prairie stretched silent under the pale light of the moon, the snow reflecting silver across the fields. For a moment he saw nothing. Then he heard it again. Hoofbeats. Far away, but unmistakable. He closed the door slowly and looked back toward the girl beside the stove. If those riders were crossing the prairie at this hour, they were not wandering. They were following a trail, and by the sound of it, they were riding straight toward Ethan Caldwell's 40 acres. The sound of hoofbeats carried across the frozen prairie again, stronger now, rolling over the quiet land like distant thunder moving slowly through the night. Ethan Caldwell stood beside the closed door of his farmhouse, listening carefully while the last trace of wind drifted across the fields. He had lived on that land long enough to recognize the difference between imagination and something real. Those were horses, and they were coming closer. Behind him, the girl beside the stove had gone very still. She was no longer focused on the warmth of the fire or the bowl resting beside her. Her attention had shifted entirely to the door, as if she could hear the same distant rhythm pressing across the land. Ethan turned and walked back toward the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to see the wide stretch of snow beyond the pasture fence. The prairie looked peaceful under the pale moonlight, but the sound continued, faint and steady, growing clearer with every passing moment. Riders moved differently at night than they did in daylight. They traveled with purpose, conserving strength, letting the horses carry them across ground they already understood. Whoever was out there knew where they were going. Ethan stepped away from the window and reached for the lantern hanging on the wall. The small flame inside flickered as he lifted it, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. The girl watched him quietly. Her voice came again, calmer now than it had been earlier in the night. My father rides fast when he searches. Ethan stopped near the table and studied her expression. She did not look frightened. If anything, she looked certain. That confidence settled something inside Ethan as well. He had heard many stories in Red Hollow about tribes moving across the plains, stories shaped by fear and misunderstanding. But sitting here beside the fire, watching, the calm certainty in the girl's eyes, he found himself trusting something simpler. A daughter who believed her father would come for her was not likely to be wrong. Still, the frontier had taught Ethan that unexpected visitors could bring many different kinds of trouble. He walked to the stove and added another piece of oak to the fire. The flames rose again, warming the room while the house creaked softly against the cold outside. "How many riders travel with your father?" Ethan asked. The girl considered the question before answering. "Enough to cross the prairie safely." Ethan nodded slowly. That could mean 5 riders or 50. On the plains, numbers often remained uncertain until the moment a man saw them with his own eyes. The hoofbeats sounded again, louder now, echoing faintly across the frozen pasture. The cattle near the fence shifted uneasily, their shapes moving slowly against the snow. Animals often noticed approaching riders before people did. Ethan placed the lantern on the table and walked toward the door once more. This time he lifted the latch and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air returned immediately, brushing his face with the sharp bite of winter. The prairie stretched wide and silent beyond the fence, but now he could see movement far out along the northern ridge where the land rose slightly before falling toward the creek valley. At first it looked like shadows moving along the horizon. Then the shapes separated. Riders. Several of them. Their horses moved steadily through the snow, dark figures against the pale ground. Ethan counted quickly. 1 rider became 3. 3 became 6. The line continued behind them, stretching along the ridge in a slow, silent procession. The moonlight caught the edge of something tall rising above the riders. Feathers. They swayed gently with the movement of the horses, bright even in the dim light. Ethan lowered his head slightly as he watched. There were more riders than he had expected. Not a hunting party. Not travelers passing through the land. This was a search. The kind led by someone who knew exactly who they were looking for. Behind him, the farmhouse door opened quietly. The girl stepped onto the porch beside him, the wool coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She looked toward the ridge without hesitation. "My father has found the trail," she said softly. The riders continued down the slope now, their shapes growing larger against the white prairie as they crossed the final stretch of open land toward Ethan Caldwell's fence. The night remained silent except for the steady rhythm of hooves approaching through the snow, and Ethan understood something important as he watched them draw closer. By the time the sun rose over the Kansas plains, the quiet life he had built on those 40 lonely acres would no longer belong only to him. The riders continued moving across the open prairie with the steady patience of men who had traveled through many nights like this one, their horses stepping carefully over frozen ground while the faint light of the moon reflected off the drifting snow. Ethan Caldwell stood on the porch of his farmhouse with the cold pressing against his coat and watched them approach without moving. Beside him, the girl remained calm, her eyes following the line of riders descending from the northern ridge toward the pasture fence. The distance between them closed slowly but steadily, and as the figures drew nearer, Ethan began to see details that had been hidden in the shadows before. Each rider sat tall in the saddle, wrapped in heavy winter blankets, their horses strong and sure-footed even in the deep cold. Some carried long staffs decorated with feathers that moved gently with every step of the horses, while others rode with nothing visible except the quiet confidence of men who understood the land beneath them. There was no shouting across the prairie, no sudden rush of speed, only the patient rhythm of hooves pressing through snow as the riders crossed the last half-mile toward Ethan Caldwell's fence line. The cattle near the pasture shifted again, but none of them panicked. The horses approaching the farm moved calmly, and animals often sensed when a rider carried purpose rather than threat. Ethan folded his arms against the cold and watched carefully. The girl beside him spoke quietly, her voice almost lost in the wide silence of the prairie. My father rides in the front. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly as he studied the leading rider. The man sat on a tall dark horse that moved with powerful ease across the frozen ground. Even from a distance, Ethan could see that the rider carried himself differently from the others, not louder or more aggressive, but with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to being followed. The line of riders slowed as they reached the fence, their horses stopping almost together as if guided by the same unspoken signal. For a long moment no one moved. The prairie held its breath beneath the pale sky, while the riders studied the small farmhouse and the lone man standing on the porch. Ethan had lived long enough on the frontier to understand moments like that. Silence often spoke louder than words. Finally, the rider in front stepped down from his horse. He moved with the calm strength of someone who had traveled far, but still carried the steady balance of experience. The feathers woven into his dark hair shifted gently as he walked toward the fence. Ethan noticed the careful way the man looked across the pasture before turning his attention toward the porch. His eyes settled on the girl standing beside Ethan. Something in his expression changed immediately. The quiet watchfulness softened into relief that could be felt even from across the distance. The girl stepped forward slightly, holding the wool coat around her shoulders while the cold morning air brushed across the prairie. The first faint color of dawn had begun to touch the eastern horizon, turning the snowfields pale gold beneath the fading moonlight. "Father," she called softly. The word traveled across the open land without effort. The man near the fence stopped and lifted his head. The riders behind him remained perfectly still, their horses calm as statues in the growing light. The man's voice came back across the pasture, strong but controlled. "Ayanna." Ethan glanced toward the girl beside him. The name suited her somehow, simple and steady like the land itself. She stepped off the porch and walked slowly across the yard toward the fence, leaving a trail of small footprints in the snow behind her. Ethan remained where he stood, watching carefully but without interference. This was not his moment. This belonged to the family who had crossed miles of frozen prairie to find one missing daughter. When Ayanna reached the fence, the man opened his arms, and she stepped forward to meet him. The reunion was quiet and brief, the kind shared by people who understood each other without needing many words. The riders behind him shifted slightly in their saddles, their attention still resting on the farmhouse and the man standing on the porch. After a moment, the father turned his gaze toward Ethan Caldwell. The two men studied one another across the snowy pasture while the dawn light slowly spread across the Kansas plains, and in that silent exchange Ethan understood something important. The riders had not come to claim anything. They had come to give thanks. The dawn light spread slowly across the Kansas prairie, turning the frozen fields from pale silver into soft shades of gold. The riders remained gathered near the fence, their horses quiet and patient as the cold morning air settled over the land. Ethan Caldwell stepped down from the porch and walked across the yard with steady, unhurried steps. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the fence line where Ayanna stood beside her father. Up close, Ethan could see the man clearly for the first time. He was older than Ethan had expected, perhaps in his late 50s, with long dark hair threaded with gray and eyes that carried the calm weight of many seasons spent crossing the open plains. His clothing was simple but carefully worn, layered against the cold in a way that showed deep familiarity with winter travel. The feathers woven into his hair shifted gently as he turned toward Ethan. For a moment neither man spoke. The riders behind the father remained mounted in a quiet half-circle along the fence, their presence steady but respectful, as if they understood that the conversation unfolding in front of them belonged to the two men standing in the snow. Ayanna looked from one to the other before stepping slightly aside, giving them space. Her father placed a hand over his chest and inclined his head in a small gesture of respect. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and calm. "I am Dakota." Ethan returned the gesture with a nod of his own. "Ethan Caldwell." Dakota's eyes moved briefly toward the farmhouse, then back to Ethan again. "My daughter told me what you did for her." Ethan shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward Ayanna before answering. "She found my fence in the storm. Anyone would have brought her inside." Dakota studied him quietly for a moment, and there was something thoughtful in his expression, as if he were weighing those words against something he had seen many times before. "Not everyone would have done that," he replied. The prairie was silent around them. except for the soft sound of horses shifting in the snow. The first sunlight of morning now touched the roof of the farmhouse and the long fence posts stretching across the pasture. Dakota turned slightly and spoke a few quiet words in his own language to the riders behind him. One of the younger men dismounted and approached, carrying a small leather bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed it respectfully to Dakota before returning to his horse. Dakota held the bundle for a moment before offering it forward to Ethan. "A gift for the man who protected my daughter from the winter." Ethan hesitated before reaching out to take it. The leather felt warm despite the cold air. When he opened the cloth carefully, he saw several small objects inside. There was a carved turquoise stone shaped like a feather, a carefully braided strip of leather decorated with tiny beads, and a folded piece of soft white cloth embroidered with delicate patterns. They were simple things, but the care placed into each one was clear. Ethan looked up again. "You do not need to give me anything." Dakota's expression softened slightly. "Gratitude must travel somewhere," he said quietly. "If it stays still, it becomes forgotten." Ayanna watched the exchange with a faint smile, the tension from the long night finally easing from her shoulders. The riders behind them began to relax as well, some adjusting blankets on their horses or glancing toward the rising sun, now warming the distant prairie. Ethan closed the bundle carefully and held it against his coat. "Thank you," he said simply. Dakota nodded once more before looking across the pasture toward the farmhouse and the open land surrounding it. "This place is far from towns." Ethan followed his gaze. 30 miles to the nearest trading post," he replied. Dakota considered that quietly. Then he looked back at Ethan with the steady calm of someone making a promise rather than a statement. "From this day forward, my people will remember this land." The wind moved gently across the prairie as the sun lifted higher above the horizon, and Ethan Caldwell realized that the quiet act of kindness he had offered on a cold winter night had just placed his small farm into the memory of an entire tribe. The sunlight continued to spread across the prairie, slowly dissolving the pale frost that had clung to the tall grass through the long winter night. Ethan Caldwell stood quietly near the fence while Dakota and Ayanna remained beside him, the three of them framed by the wide openness of the Kansas plains. Behind Dakota, the riders waited with the same patient stillness they had shown since arriving at the farm. Their horses shifted occasionally, warm breath drifting into the crisp morning air like small clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The prairie felt different now that the sun had risen. What had been shadow and uncertainty during the night had become clear land stretching for miles in every direction. Ethan glanced across his pasture, noticing the thin line of smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney where the fire still burned inside. The simple home had never seemed important beyond keeping him alive through the seasons. Yet now it stood at the center of something he had not expected. Dakota turned his gaze slowly across the farm as well, studying the land with the careful attention of someone who understood how a place could shape the life of the man who lived there. "Your land is quiet," he said after a moment. Ethan gave a small nod. "Quiet enough that some people forget it exists." Dakota's eyes carried a faint hint of amusement. "Land remembers, even when people forget." Ayanna stood nearby, watching the exchange with a calm expression that reflected the growing warmth of the morning. The strain of the night had left her face completely now, replaced by the relaxed confidence of someone who had returned safely to her own people. She stepped closer to her father and spoke softly in their language. Dakota listened carefully before turning back toward Ethan again. "My daughter tells me you live here alone." Ethan nodded once more. "The nearest neighbor is nearly 10 miles east. Most folks in Red Hollow say I picked the loneliest 40 acres in Kansas." Dakota looked toward the horizon where the prairie rolled gently toward distant cottonwood trees along the creek. "Sometimes the quiet places are the strongest places," he replied. "They allow a man to hear his own heart." Ethan considered those words quietly. Out on the frontier, a man often heard more wind than wisdom, but there was something steady in Dakota's voice that made the thought linger. Behind them, several riders began speaking quietly among themselves as the morning light strengthened. The long search across the winter prairie had ended, and the tension that had carried them through the night was slowly easing into relief. One of the riders guided his horse forward a few steps and exchanged a brief conversation with Dakota in their language before returning to the others. Dakota watched them for a moment, then turned again toward Ethan. "We will ride south today," he said. The winter camps are waiting for our return. Ethan nodded in understanding. The prairie was wide, but winter demanded careful movement. Tribes and settlers alike planned their travel with the weather rather than against it. Dakota extended his hand slowly, offering it to Ethan with quiet respect. When Ethan clasped it, he felt the firm strength of a man who had spent many years guiding others across land that offered little forgiveness to those who misunderstood it. You gave my daughter warmth when the storm tried to take it from her, Dakota said. That kindness will travel farther than you can see. Ethan released the handshake and glanced again across the open fields. Out here, most days passed without witness. Crops grew or failed quietly. Seasons changed without announcement. Yet this moment, simple as it seemed, felt as though it would remain long after the snow melted and the prairie grass turned green again. Iana stepped forward once more before returning to her horse. She looked back at Ethan with a small, grateful smile. When the riders began turning their horses toward the southern plains, the sound of hooves returned to the quiet land, but this time it carried a different meaning. It was not the sound of a search crossing the night. It was the sound of a story leaving the farm and traveling across the wide American prairie, carried by riders who would remember the man who had chosen kindness on a freezing winter night. The riders began to move at last, turning their horses slowly toward the southern prairie, while the early sunlight stretched long shadows across the snow. Ethan Caldwell stood beside the fence watching them go, the quiet rhythm of hooves fading gradually into the wide morning air. Iana was the last to ride past the gate. She paused for a moment and looked back toward the small farmhouse and the man standing alone beside the pasture. Her expression carried the same calm gratitude Ethan had seen when she first woke beside the fire. Then she guided her horse forward and followed the others across the open land. The line of riders moved steadily across the prairie, their figures growing smaller against the rolling fields until the feathers in their hair became little more than faint movements in the distance. Eventually, even those shapes disappeared beyond the low rise near the cottonwood grove, leaving the land exactly as it had been before they arrived. Quiet, endless, and almost unbelievably still. Ethan remained by the fence for several minutes after the last rider vanished from sight. The cold had softened with the rising sun, and the thin frost along the pasture posts began to melt into clear drops of water that fell slowly into the snow. The cattle resumed grazing calmly, their earlier restlessness gone, as if the prairie itself had accepted that the moment had passed. Ethan finally turned back toward the farmhouse, the leather bundle Dakota had given him still resting in his hands. Inside the house, the warmth from the stove lingered in the air, and the faint smell of oak smoke mixed with the lingering scent of stew from the night before. The room looked exactly the same as it had before the riders arrived. The same wooden table near the window. The same iron kettle resting above the stove. The same pair of worn chairs that had carried him through years of quiet evenings alone. Yet something about the place felt different now. Ethan placed the leather bundle carefully on the table and opened it once more. The turquoise feather glowed softly in the sunlight that filtered through the window, its polished surface reflecting a thin line of blue across the rough wood of the table. He turned it slowly in his fingers, studying the careful carving along its edges. The braided leather strip beside it had been woven with tiny beads the color of desert sand and deep sky blue, patterns that likely carried meaning far older than the small farmhouse that now held them. Ethan did not pretend to understand those meanings, but he could feel the weight of the gift all the same. It was not simply an object. It was a memory made solid. He stepped outside again after a moment, walking slowly toward the pasture where the riders had stood earlier that morning. Their tracks remained, clearly visible across the snow, dozens of hoofprints stretching across the fields in a wide, curved line that pointed toward the southern horizon. Ethan followed the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared into the distance. On the frontier, stories often traveled in quiet ways. A man might help a traveler one night and never see him again. A kindness might vanish into the wind like smoke from a chimney. But sometimes the prairie remembered. Sometimes the land carried those moments farther than any road or river could. Ethan Caldwell stood in the sunlight with the turquoise feather resting in his hand and realized that something simple had changed without him noticing the exact moment it happened. He had lived on those 40 lonely acres believing the world beyond his fence moved without ever touching his life. Yet somewhere beyond the southern hills, riders were now carrying the memory of his small farmhouse across the wide plains. And on the frontier, that kind of memory could travel farther than a man ever expected. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Kansas prairie over the weeks that followed, and the hard white snow that had covered Ethan Caldwell's 40 acres began to melt into dark soil beneath the returning sun. Days grew longer, and the wind that once carried sharp cold across the fields softened into something warmer, carrying the distant smell of thawing earth and dry grass waking again after the long sleep of winter. Life on the farm returned to its familiar rhythm. Ethan rose before sunrise most mornings, stepping out into the quiet land to tend the cattle and repair the worn fence posts that the winter storms had pushed loose. The prairie stretched just as wide and silent as it always had, and for a while it almost felt as if the strange morning with Dakota and the riders had been nothing more than a passing dream carried away with the melting snow. Yet small reminders of that morning remained. The turquoise feather rested on the wooden shelf above Ethan's table, where the sunlight touched it every afternoon through the narrow window. Sometimes he would pause while working and glance at it, remembering the quiet moment when dozens of riders had stood across his pasture and a father had spoken words of gratitude beneath the rising sun. The land itself seemed unchanged, but Ethan noticed something subtle. Over the following months, travelers began appearing along the distant prairie trails more often than before. Not many, and rarely close enough to reach the farmhouse itself, but now and then he would spot riders passing along the ridge near the cottonwood grove. Sometimes they would raise a hand in greeting before continuing south across the plains. Ethan could never say for certain whether those riders belonged to Dakota's people or were simply travelers crossing the territory, but there was always something respectful in the way they passed the land, as if they already knew the story of the small farm beside the open prairie. One evening near the end of spring, Ethan sat on the porch watching the sky turn amber behind the distant hills while the cattle settled quietly in the pasture. The warm wind carried the sound of meadowlarks singing somewhere beyond the fence line, and the prairie grass moved in slow waves beneath the fading sunlight. Ethan turned the turquoise feather slowly in his hand, its smooth surface catching the last light of day. Out here on the frontier, a man could spend years believing the world beyond his land moved without ever noticing him. Farms were small things compared to the endless plains. One man's choices rarely traveled farther than the fence posts surrounding his property. But sometimes the prairie proved otherwise. Sometimes the smallest act carried farther than expected. Ethan placed the feather back on the shelf beside the window and looked out across the quiet fields one more time before the sun slipped fully below the horizon. Somewhere beyond the southern plains, riders still crossed the land with the same patient rhythm that had carried them to his farm on that cold winter morning. And among those riders, the story of a lonely farmer who had opened his door to a freezing traveler would continue to move quietly from camp to camp, carried across the wide American frontier without need for roads or newspapers. Ethan Caldwell never asked for that story to spread. He had only done what seemed right on a bitter winter night when the wind had been strong and the prairie had offered no shelter to a lost girl. Yet out on the open plains, kindness had a way of traveling farther than any man could ride, and long after the snow of that winter had melted into spring grass, the land itself still remembered.